Beheaded with a hatchet, murdered by soldiers, eaten alive by sharks, eaten alive by gators, blown up, ripped apart, and thrown into a river. This is your body, and this is your body in a Dreamworks film. We already talked about the villains' deaths, so today we're ranking Dreamworks Non-Main Villains Deaths, gruesome to most disturbing. We'll begin with those characters whose deaths were greatly exaggerated, if you will.
My death was greatly exaggerated.
These are the temporary deaths, and no, we aren't counting Metro Man. He just happened to have the perfect line to kick things off. While some would argue that this one wasn't canon, we're giving Creek from Trolls the lowest spot on our list. Now, in Creek's defense, his very, very limited defense, he, like the other trolls, went through a lot in this movie. He was savored by Gristle throughout the film, and the literal only thing he was able to do to save his own skin was to betray his own people to the Bergens, with seemingly no remorse at all, granted.
At least you get to die with a clear conscience.
While his decision was at least understandable, it still isn't good by any means, which is why we definitely can't say we felt sorry for him being eaten by a hill monster. Still, unlike the chef, Creek at least had a somewhat sympathetic reason, so as bad as his decision to betray his people was, giving him another chance in the Beat Goes On spin-off series was a nice choice. Yeah, it's revealed that Creek somehow survived being eaten by the hill monster, and while I'm absolutely certain that wasn't a pleasant experience, the fact that Creek not only cheated death, but was ultimately welcomed back by the friends he turned on shows that the universe was feeling very merciful to him. I guess every troll deserves a second chance, even if he owes them a lot of apology songs. Already rounding out this category, we have the Sandman from Rise of the Guardians. Sandy was always one of the most powerful guardians in the movie, with the power to give sleep and sweet dreams to the children of the world. This also made him a particularly high priority target for Pitch Black, whose whole goal was to shroud the entire world in darkness and nightmares. Despite an epic battle, Sandman is distracted enough by Pitch's army to be defeated by a single arrow to the back, turning him into a nightmare and forcing him to go against his old friends. That's a pretty brutal way to go, even if he does peacefully succumb to it, almost as if to say, you know what? Nah, you guys got this. And thankfully, they did got this, because Sandman is not only restored to his former glory, but he's the one who ultimately takes Pitch down. An encouraging sign to never give up, not even when you're dead. With that, let's move on to the characters who weren't lucky enough to get a full-on second chance. These characters passed due to natural causes. Master Oogway is first up in this category. Thankfully for him, the Kung Fu Panda series has plenty of spirit realm stuff involved with it, so while Oogway does pass away in the first movie, it doesn't stop him from playing a big role via both flashbacks and post-mortem advice to Po. And while it might have to do entirely with just how unbelievably chill Oogway is, it's also worth noting that he was completely unfazed by his own death.
My time has come.
Simply passing his staff to Master Shifu and peacefully moving on to the other side. Even death itself wasn't cruel enough to give Oogway anything but a peaceful end, and I appreciate that personally. While we don't have a lot of information on the deaths of Yi's father, that in itself indicates that his death was probably normal. There's no mention of foul play or anything like that.
Was this your dad's violin?
Mm-hmm.
All we know is that poor Yi's dad is pushing up daisies, a tragedy that shook her world to its core. The most brutal aspect of this one is that he never got to travel the world with his daughter, which, although it's sad, doesn't indicate that his death was anything other than natural, just earlier than it ought to have been. But sometimes you just gotta live and let die. Take it from King Harold from Shrek III.
Well, somebody better be dying.
Ooh, Shrek buddy, not the greatest timing there.
I'm dying.
It's unknown what illness finally took the life of Fiona's amphibious old man, but it was brutal enough for him to be coughing up his lungs on his deathbed. And given the fact that he passed out and regained consciousness at least one time during this whole exchange, I'm gonna place my bet on the idea that this was not a pleasant way to go. Still, it was relatively peaceful as far as deaths go, and Harold wasn't exactly young either, so he definitely lived a full life and let die a full life. Tragically, the same can't be said for Ramses' son. He does have a name, but yeah, I don't want to butcher that. Okay, I'll try. Amun Chef? That sounds right. With the power of God on his side, Moses spends most of the movie desperately trying to get Ramses, his adoptive brother, to see the error of his ways and let his people go. Unfortunately, even after 9 separate plagues throughout the land, the pharaoh would refuse to listen to reason, which led to the 10th and most brutal plague, the deaths of all firstborn sons of Egypt, including Amun, the light of Ramses' life, and a boy who, despite his father's evil, was genuinely beloved to him. It's a heartbreaking scene to watch, and while he passes passes peacefully, the fact that it took an innocent child's death to move his father to free the Hebrew slaves is easily the most brutal aspect of the movie. Now, these next few won't hit quite that same note of tragedy, but these quick and relatively painless deaths still pack a punch, even if it's just one punch. First up, we have Humpty A. Dumpty, the former friend and partner in crime of Puss in Boots. Humpty did not have the best track record, to say the least. He betrayed Puss multiple times, constantly endangered the people around him, and only decided to turn himself around at the very end of his life. That said, it's better late than never. When it comes to time for Puss to choose between pulling Humpty or the golden gosling up, Humpty simplifies the choice by allowing himself a great, peaceful fall, revealing himself to have a heart of gold, or an egg of gold. It may be a sort of sad, mostly unintentionally funny demise, but Humpty went out on his own terms and saved his soul in the process. Next, we have to give a quick mention to the Egyptian slave driver from The Prince of Egypt. Now, I don't know what possessed this man to accept top-tier work from an elderly worker who isn't being paid for his work, and to reiterate, is elderly, but I do know what possessed Moses, pure, unfiltered rage, and as he rushed to stand up for the old man against that corrupt Egyptian, he ended up inadvertently pushing him off a ledge, sending him plummeting to his doom, and forcing Moses to flee as a result. The slave driver did seem to die instantly, so it wasn't a painful death, and considering the whole slave owner aspect of his character, he definitely got a nicer fate than he deserved with that in mind. In a slightly more sympathetic light, next we have Rock, the icy bird from Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas. One of many foes Sinbad faces on his journey to retrieve the lost book of peace, Rock here is a gigantic bird who lives on an icy mountain. Unfortunately for Rock, Sinbad was able to use its environment to his own advantage, and by luring it right underneath a huge pile of boulders, well, he's able to cause an avalanche with some crushing effects. From one crushing defeat to another, next up is Frankie from Shark Tale. When this mob boss shark is crushed by an anchor during his pursuit of Oscar, the latter is able to hype himself up as a shark-slaying hero of the sea. We place his death below Rock's because despite him being a shark, Frankie had more humanity.
I'm so cold. That's just because we're cold-blooded.
As vicious as he was a shark operating the only way he really knew how to, and while having his skull crushed would have led to a pretty quick death, it still wasn't necessarily what he deserved. Everybody knows that the bird is the word, and in case of this bird from Shrek, that word is pop. Yeah, honestly, this one doesn't need much explanation. That said, it does get some bonus brutality points for the fact that after this bird dies, Fiona proceeds to cook its unborn children for breakfast. That's just messed up, girl, even if delicious. But if we're gonna talk about explosions with multiple casualties, we can't leave Tai Lung's guards out of the discussion. During his epic escape sequence, we get a sense of just how ruthless and terrifying Tai Lung is. For his farewell party, Tai Lung is nice enough to give the gang a fireworks show. Unfortunately, by total and complete accident. The fireworks in question were this weird brand called Dynamite? Yeah, crazy, right? Anyway, Tai Lung killed hundreds of people in that explosion who were just doing their job to keep him away from the Valley of Peace. How he became so much more chill by the fourth movie, it's beyond me. I guess dying helps. But since we mentioned fireworks, let's talk about Master Thundering Rhino from the sequel. Sure, this is just one guy compared to hundreds who passed during Tai Lung's show of power, but that's the thing. Tai Lung didn't directly murder the prison guards per se, they just happened to be casualties of his great escape. Lord Shen, on the other hand, was ready to share his mighty firework cannon with the world. Master Thundering Rhino was ready to fight mano a mano, but Shen isn't exactly the manly type, and as a result, he decided to make Master Thundering Rhino the test subject for his great new weapon. And on the bright side, the test was very successful. On the downside, rip Thundering Rhino. Glad they didn't send one of the Furious Five to stop him at that point, right? Speaking of major characters, it's high time we get back to tragic stuff. Up next is Stoic the Vast from How to Train Your Dragon 2. Stoic is one of the best written characters Dreamworks has ever put out, which is why his end in the second movie was particularly tough to stomach. After finally reconciling with his son and even reuniting with his wife, who he thought was long dead and gone, Stoic met his end at the hands, or breath rather, of a mind-controlled Toothless. Under the control of Drago's Bewilderbeast, Toothless followed his temporary master's bidding and prepared to kill Hiccup with an energy beam at point-blank range, but Stoic at the very last second died the most honorable death a dad could die. He sacrificed his life to save his son. Like Thundering Rhino, Stoic got hit with the full force of an explosion, and although he chose to do so, he got even closer than Rhino did. That's not to mention the fact that he was killed accidentally by his son's pet and greatest biggest ally, jeopardizing their friendship for a time. It's just brutal stuff, man. Rounding out this category, we have the latest in Dreamworks' character deaths, Longneck from The Wild Robot. As the only goose who was even remotely interested in giving poor Bright Bill a chance, Longneck earned the respect of both Roz and the audience right away, and when it came time for them to migrate, he'd take Bright Bill under his wing as part of his formation.
Been ages since I had a youngster in my formation. What do you say?
I promise I'll keep up.
Unfortunately, they'd end up on the wrong end of some Rozums who identified them as intruders, leading to Bright Bill taking charge and bringing the formation to safety, while Longneck distracted them and took the brunt of their fire. While it's entirely possible, and likely honestly, that Longneck died instantly, he didn't die without having to distract the Rozums and confuse their aim for several minutes, and even then, if one hit wasn't enough to finish the job, it could have been a more prolonged death. Regardless, we don't see it on screen, so we'll just conclude that Longneck died as he lived, a hero and an absolute giga-chad of a goose. But whether they died as heroes, villains, or somewhere in between, those in this next category suffered some painful demises. Although they're only secondary antagonists, you could argue that the Toad's Hench Rats kind of earned their demises. I mean, they are working with a guy who's plotting a legitimate genocide against rodent kind after all, so you could argue these class traitors earned themselves a pretty brutal fate, as mean as that sounds.
Oh, hi boss.
While they died in various different ways, none of them were pretty. From falling off of icy ramps to being frozen in liquid nitrogen to just straight up drowning in sewer water, flushed away, if you will. They met their maker in some pretty dark ways. But if you're afraid of the dark, worry not. The shark from Madagascar 2's fate was anything but dark. In fact, it was quite bright. He died in a literal blaze of glory when he made the mistake of chasing down Mort, a demon of unparalleled strength and malice. Mort had the mercy to not smite the shark right away, but not the mercy to spare him entirely, luring him as a sacrifice into the local volcano. It was flashy, sure, but it was pretty instantaneous, which is good for the shark at least. That said, I'm not sure how pleasant it was for him to be chasing Mort on land for what I can only assume was several miles at least. From a shark's death to a death at the jaws of several sharks, Ariel from Shrek 2 is next. Dreamworks movies, specifically the Shrek saga, are no stranger to poking fun at Disney and other classic fairy tales. I mean, it's like the whole theme of the movie's humor. In the opening scene to Shrek 2, we see Shrek and Fiona enjoying their honeymoon. We also see the Little Mermaid herself enjoying the honeymoon as she somehow swaps places with Fiona, garnering the wrath of the ogres and turning herself into shark food as a result. That's a bit of an extreme reaction, maybe, but in Fiona's defense, all she did was toss her back into the ocean. Karma did the rest. Next up, we have a very minor antagonist, the Boss Wolf from Kung Fu Panda 2. It might seem odd that Shen's second in command doesn't even have a proper name, but that actually reflects the way his boss thinks of him pretty darn accurately.
We're loading ships now.
In the final act of the film, Shen orders him to light the cannon, and when the wolf points out that the explosion would kill some of his pack, Shen has absolutely zero concern, proving that he never actually cared about his men, only what they could do for him. Tragically, the one good deed the boss wolf does throughout the movie, that being to stand up for himself and his pack, was met with hostility as Shen shanked him without a second thought. It was a death that couldn't have been avoided unless the guy was pure evil, and that's pretty sad when you think about it. Next we have easily the biggest entry on the list, Galaxar's entire planet. Galaxar might just be the most comically maniacal villain in Dreamworks history for no reason but a sad childhood and a crummy marriage. He decides the logical course of action then is to destroy his whole planet and species.
I'm sorry your planet was destroyed.
Oh, don't be. I'm the one who destroyed it.
While an instantaneous explosion like this could have fit in the previous category, this is the death of an entire planet, like a full-on genocide, or a planet-side. I don't even know if that's a word. This dude is the type of killer who makes you pull out a dictionary. That's the kind of brutality we're talking about here, people. Next we have an umbrella entry for Dulox's Knights from Shrek. These guys refused Shrek's generous offer to settle their differences over a pint, rather than jumping straight to murder. They Shreked around, and they would therefore find out the hard way that this ogre and his noble steed were not a duo to be trifled with. From being tossed around like rag dolls, rolled over by gigantic barrels, and straight up crushed in WWE-style rings, these knights got styled on in such brutal ways that Farquaad couldn't help but blast some music in the background. Sometimes leaders have to make noble, totally not inhumane sacrifices to do their work, a lesson that Zeko Khan's acolyte would also be learning by experience. Always pick your line of work carefully, kids. If you don't, you might just end up screwed. Take this poor acolyte, for instance. instance. Jekyll Khan is right on the cusp of finishing the elixir, but he just needs a little more life thrown into it. So without a second thought, he decides to give his acolyte one final job, and that job is simply being an ingredient. Being betrayed like that had to have been pretty brutal, and who knows how painful it is to be part of an elixir. Like, are you liquefied? Do you just fade out of existence? It's one of those deaths that's less outwardly gruesome and more disturbing on account of how much it leaves to the imagination. The same can be said for the tragic death of Po's mother from Kung Fu Panda 2. Despite being a sequel to the funny panda kung fu movie, Kung Fu Panda 2 is easily one of the darkest movies DreamWorks has ever put out. It deals with Po confronting the trauma of his past, which just so happens to concern him being one of the few survivors of a panda genocide led by Lord Shen. We see his mother hide her baby, from said baby's perspective, from the soldiers, fleeing right afterwards. While thankfully the movie was kind enough to spare us the details, we know from the third movie's confirmation that his mother tragically died in that escape attempt. While she at least succeeded in protecting her baby boy, who would go on to protect countless others as the Dragon Warrior, there's little doubt that her demise was a cruel one, especially given how ruthless and callous Lord Shen was. Closing out our penultimate tier, we have Guy's parents from The Croods. We only ever see them via a flashback, but it's known that they died while sinking in a pit of tar. If that one SpongeBob episode taught me anything, it's that sinking in a pit of tar is a slow process. One where the only bright side is that it gives you just enough time to use your final words as a means of encouraging your son to never give up on himself or his dreams. Drowning is a cruel enough fate, but to drown in something other than water, it sounds downright unpleasant. Well, like dying in general sounds pretty unpleasant, but if I just had to choose a method, this one would definitely be near the bottom of my list. Speaking of near the bottom of my list, we're finally here. 6 more deaths remain for today's discussion, and these final few are downright disturbing deaths. Being a cookie in a world of people who eat cookies can't be easy. Take it from alternate timeline Gingy, for instance. Shrek's contract with Rumpelstiltskin resulted in a whole lot of changes to his own life and to those of his friends. Gingy, for example, went from a wisecracking cookie to a ruthless animal cracker crushing gladiator. He plays a pretty minor role, but in the movie's final act, he gets a chance to shine by offering Shrek some invaluable info on Rumpel. Finally, some spotlight. And did Puss just actually eat Gingy? No, like, I need you to process this with me. We've actually just watched one iconic Shrek character straight up consume another without a second thought. Yeah, Gingy is alive and well when the timeline gets restored to normal, but still, that's some seriously wild stuff for a kid's movie. It really makes you think to yourself, what a wonderful world, eh? Take it from this little duck from Madagascar. In a final gambit to protect his friends from his predatory instincts, Alex makes the difficult choice to live life as a predator in Madagascar. It's a wake-up call to his friends who realize that outside of the zoo, the circle of life can actually be pretty darn cruel. In one particularly tragic moment, the now trio tries to save a baby duck from the ruthless jungle by taking the little darling over to a peaceful stream. Aw, look at that, he's so cute, and oh yeah, there was an alligator in there. Alright, rest in peace, baby duck from Madagascar. You're the one who truly made DreamWorks what it is today. It's one thing to be eaten by a predator, but to be eaten by your own kind has to be even crueler. Just outside of the top 3, we have to talk about the sushi shop menu from Shark Tale. If you watched Shark Tale and wondered why the sushi shop towards the beginning of the movie has literally no business, well, do me a favor. Google what sushi is and then come back to me. You done yet? Good. So, yeah, I have no idea why this guy's allowed to run a business where he sells the flesh of his own kind as food. Like, has nobody called the cops on this guy? At least they aren't eaten on screen, though, even if they sure are ready for it. The bronze medal of brutality goes to the Gronkle from How to Train Your Dragon. This guy's death is the revelation of why dragons are seemingly so hostile to Vikings, and really all other living creatures in general. They aren't taking sacrifices to be cruel or greedy or anything. Rather, they're taking them as sacrifices to the Red Death, the biggest and scariest dragon of the bunch. What happens if they don't bring food, you ask? Well, don't worry about that. They always bring food. For example, this Gronkle only offered one measly fish to his boss. No problem, though. He's got wings, bones, arms, legs, eyes, a whole buffet right there in front of her. Bon appetit, Red Death. The silver medal of brutality goes to the steak raiser of Chicken Run, Edwina. But first, this video is brought to you by Wicked Binge channel memberships. You can gain access to our videos early before anyone else, plus gain access to members-only emojis and loyalty badges by supporting the channel through a membership. A chicken farm has to make a profit, so if a chicken stops laying eggs, there's only one logical thing to do. Chop it up and make it into a nice, reasonably priced meal. Whether you're a vegan or a meat lover of the highest caliber, you can't deny that the way Mrs. Tweety runs her farm is pretty cruel. The chickens live in constant fear of her, knowing that if they don't meet their quota, they'll be in for certain death. Sure, the death itself is a simple beheading. In other words, it's more or less instantaneous, but it's worth noting that chickens usually survive a few seconds after losing their heads. In 1945, there was a case where one lived for 18 months without it. Thankfully, this wasn't the case for Edwina, but the sheer terror she experienced slowly being carried to the cutting table is enough to call this one of the most brutal deaths in DreamWorks history. But in an absolute landslide, the most brutal fate in DreamWorks history has to be that of Mongo from Shrek 2. Gingy's connection to the Muffin Man proves to be invaluable in the final battle.
Fire up the ovens, Muffin Man! We've got a big order to fill!
When it comes time to storm the castle, the gang gets him to bake Gingy a gigantic sun to carry them there. He takes hits from fireballs and all sorts of weapons, but tragically, the soldiers prove themselves ready for anything with the cookie's greatest nemesis, milk. After being doused with milk twice, not to mention losing one of his gumdrop buttons, Mongo falls to his end in the castle's moat. What makes this one the most brutal, aside from the fact that Mongo is basically a gigantic cookie slash baby, is the fact that he's dying in water. Make a mental note of what liquid does to a cookie. The crumbs slowly break off, sometimes whole chunks will separate and fall to the bottom of the cup, etc. In other words, Mongo is being slowly ripped apart piece by piece underwater, and before you say he's gonna drown before it gets too painful, in the iconic Livin' La Vida Loca cover by Puss and a Donkey, Mongo is still conscious enough to join in for a line. He's somehow dying with a smile on his face, which at least indicates that he's not feeling pain. But from our point of view, the dude is being slowly, very slowly disintegrated crumb by crumb, and the dude has a lot of crumbs. You're a true hero, Mongo. Here's to enjoying all of the gumdrop buttons you can carry in heaven.